So you want to understand George Orwell, and maybe you haven't read any of his works. Maybe all that you've read is Animal Farm or 1984, or maybe you just want to know where to go next. In this video, I'll give you a framework for understanding George Orwell's works and some suggestions of authors you can explore once you're finished with it. In a word, Orwell writes about oppression, and this can stem from two main sources, either from poverty, from an authoritarian force, or even from both. And we can understand George Orwell's works by where they fall on this poverty authoritarian spectrum. So taking Down and Out in Paris and London, we can see that that falls mainly on the poverty end, and taking Animal Farm, that falls mainly on the authoritarian end. Not that they don't have some overlap in terms of themes. Filling in some of his other works, moving from poverty towards authoritarianism, we have Road to Wigan Pier, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, Coming Up Friar, and 1984. It's also worth noting that this move from poverty towards authoritarianism also followed the path of George Orwell's writing career, primarily in response to the events of the 20th century. Orwell's most famous works, 1984 and Animal Farm, were also his latest, and those that dealt most heavily with the authoritarian themes. In a way, we could say that all of George Orwell's works were leading up to 1984. Animal Farm aside, as that came later, but it could almost be seen as an allegory or an annex attached to 1984. 1984 is a classic dystopian novel, in the sense that the primary focus of the book is how a minority force is able to control the majority. And control is really the key aspect of dystopia. We see how this manifests in different ways within 1984. Language is controlled, and any language which could lead to dissent is on the path of eradication. The past is controlled, as well as the present, and, by extension, the future. Anything that could, again, lead to dissent is crushed and removed from the records, so that the present mode of being is all that exists. Privacy is invaded, as you're under constant surveillance, even within your own head, the ultimate invasion of privacy. Nothing is sacred and nothing is safe from Big Brother, the entity that watches over every single aspect of the individual within 1984, much like the KGB, Stasi and Gestapo were in the 20th century. Countering this overwhelming control, we have the individuals, like Winston and Julia within 1984. They make small rebellions, and ultimately, they attempt to maintain their spirit and their individuality. If they can protect themselves, protect what's in their head, then they can never be defeated by Big Brother. It's ironic in some ways to discuss rebellion, as Big Brother stemmed from a rebellion, but it's a rebellion gone wrong. A revolution that didn't live up to its promises, what it said it could be, much like the revolution in Animal Farm, but also in the real world, in the revolutions of the 20th century. Starting even earlier from the French Revolution, that and the Russian Revolution at the beginning of the 20th century were the best examples of how a revolution can come to resemble the worst of the tyranny that it said it was replacing. And all that hope, all that promise is gone. And the world that they now live in is significantly worse than the one that was replaced. So building up to 1984, we can start with George Orwell's earliest main work, that is Down and Out in Paris and London. This is a biographical account of George Orwell's experience working in hotel kitchens in Paris and living with tramps in London. There are two main thematic takeaways that we can bring from this book towards 1984, and that is that of small rebellions by the working classes against the bourgeoisie, and the idea of maintaining spirit. The small rebellions primarily take the place of ruining the customer's food, as an act of spite and a display of contempt against the wealthier classes. But the idea of spirit for me was much more interesting, and this came in the form of a discussion with the tramp in the second half of the book. From George Orwell's perspective, if a man has no money, then he has no freedom. Poverty is a source of oppression, and all that he can think about is his next meal, how to survive. However, the more he lives with the tramps and the more he talks to them, he realizes that freedom doesn't stem from wealth. And whether you're rich or poor, if your thoughts are free, then you yourself are free. If you can stay in control of your own mind, if you can keep your sanity and keep your spirit, then the material world to an extent does not matter. It's about the individual control and the individual freedoms that is most important. It was these small rebellions and this maintenance of spirit which clearly translated into 1984 in the efforts of Winston to defy the party by writing in his diary and his relationship with Julia. Next we move on to Keep the Aspidistra Flying, which tells of a man's effort to survive outside the economic system that he lives in, while he is constantly being pulled back into it by his friend and his girlfriend. Again, we see the idea of small rebellions and the want to act in spite, to defy the system that you believe to be so oppressive. We see the poverty element in that sense, with a total rejection of the economic system, and by extension, that means surviving on the most meagre of supplies. Here we delve more into the political systems that can be used to oppress as well, as after all, the economic system is one that is set up by a political entity. And so it is that entity which is enforcing the oppression of this economic system, as the makings of the authoritarian oppression start to appear within George Orwell's works. There is another element that is introduced here, and that is of the romantic side of things, as the protagonist of Keep the Aspidistra Flying is in a relationship, and this is one which will manifest much more strongly in 1984. In both Keep the Aspidistra Flying and in 1984, we see how the absence of sex can be used as an oppressive tool. However, they have different sources. Within Keep the Aspidistra Flying, the protagonist feels that he is not worthy of women and also not worthy of sex due to his insufficient status within society and his poverty. However, in 1984, the abstinence and the enforced chastity comes from the authoritarian force, and sex is actually a form of rebellion. The protagonist in Keep the Aspidistra Flying is faced with the challenge of, will he stick to his principles or will he pursue his relationship? If he can sacrifice his principles, enter back into the economic system, get a higher paying job, then he believes that he can have a more fulfilling relationship. But what is the choice that he will make? In 1984, we have a similar choice. Will you pursue the relationship that puts you contrary to everything that the society that you live in demands? Or will you submit to the regime? And will you betray your relationship? Those are the two choices that our protagonist in 1984 and Keep the Aspidistra Flying must face. Down and Out in Paris and London and Keep the Aspidistra Flying also have an examination of the underworld, which to an extent can be seen as where the proles in 1984 stem from. They also stem from the third book that we're going to look at, which is Road to Wigan Pier. This is a non-fiction account of George Orwell's time staying in the industrial towns and, perhaps most specifically, living with coal miners and experiencing their work, their home life and their leisure time. Another examination which would inform the creation of the proles in 1984 and an examination of the underworld of society. What follows the non-fiction account in Road to Wigan Pier is an essay on socialism, and here we see a more brutal examination of the political system. This translates directly in 1984 into the Book of the Rebellion, the Manifesto of the Rebellion, written by Goldstein. Next, we have Coming Up for Air, and this is where we really see the authoritarian element start to manifest. The book is set in the build-up to World War II, and within it the protagonist can already see the grip tightening on society and how surveillance and how tyranny is only going to build in the coming years. And the protagonist wants to take one last chance to escape it, to return back to his childhood, escape the oppression of the city, and return to nature, which is a theme that has run throughout George Orwell's works. In Keep the Aspidistra Flying and in 1984, there was an escape to nature by the two couples. In Road to Wigan Pier and in Down and Out in Paris and London, we see the oppression of the city and how it's the city and the industrial centres which are the real source of human misery. Whereas in the rural areas, in nature, humans can be free, they can be themselves. There is less surveillance, there is less control, and they are a source of freedom. This exploration of tyranny is then developed further in 1984 and crowned in Animal Farm. Animal Farm dealing directly with the reality and the brutality of revolution and an examination of political systems and how they can exert control, building off the ideas of the exploitation of language and the past that was present in 1984. So what does this all mean for navigating his work? If we take 1984 as a starting point, as this is his most popular work, where to go from there? If you like the element of the proles and want to understand a bit more why Winston in 1984 said that hope lies with the proles, then Down and Out in Paris and London and Road to Wigan Pier are your best bets. They're the ones which informed George Orwell's writing and understanding of the proles and the underworld. Within them you will see the different sides to that aspect of society, and it gives a bit of a better insight into their role, their relationship with the bourgeoisie, and also George Orwell's opinion on socialism in general, which is primarily seen in Road to Wigan Pier. Which brings us to the next aspect, which is that of political systems. So Road to Wigan Pier has George Orwell's early thoughts on socialism and its potential to tyrannize, and then Animal Farm, which comes at the end of the 40s. You can see that development and that manifestation of the reality of a tyrannizing socialism or any tyrannizing political system. So if you'd like to look more at authoritarian systems and how they can develop, Animal Farm primarily, but there was also an aspect within Road to Wigan Pier, specifically looking at socialism. If the most interesting aspect of 1984 was the aspect of the Winston and Julia relationship, then perhaps Keep the Aspidistra Flying is an interesting follow-up. It focuses more heavily on the relationship aspect. It's by no means a romance novel, but it is more present within that. There is this idea of betrayal and your principles versus your romantic interests, which also comes to a head in 1984. So if you want a bit more of that, then you can look at Keep the Aspidistra Flying, although potentially you'd be better off looking outside of George Orwell's canon, which we'll get to in a moment. Finally, we have Coming Up for Air, which I suppose in a way could look like a prologue to 1984, although much earlier. However, it represents a society which is not dystopian. It's one that we would recognise, and it examines how authoritarianism is beginning to encroach upon the lives of the individuals and that natural individual desire to escape it, which is a trait shared by Winston in 1984, but this is the more beginnings of it. But what if you want to look outside of Orwell's works? So there are a number of different places you can go, and I'm going to make recommendations based on philosophy, history, and also fiction. And they'll be based on thematic. So if there's a particular theme that you enjoyed within Orwell's works, this is the direction that I think you should go in. If you enjoyed the sanctity of the individual versus a crowd oppression, then I think Nietzsche is the place to go, as that was his main idea. Nietzsche can be a difficult read at times, as he is very provocative with his language and really had no filter. It's also probably important in that case to consider the time that he was writing in the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century. But if you want to read someone and the philosophical discussions on individualism and crowd control, then that is the best place to start. Primarily, he looks at the relationship of the individual to the oppression exerted by Christianity, but it can be applied to any system, and arguably was most aptly applied in the 20th century with the political regimes. I think the best place to start is on the Genealogy of Morals, as it is quite a short book and perhaps easier to digest, as I think it is also more targeted with less random maxims, which some of Nietzsche's other works can fall into. If you want to look at how the crowd control did manifest in the 20th century, then I think history is the best way to go about it. And the two books that I recommend on that, one for the Soviet Union would be Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. And if you want to look at authoritarianism in Germany with the Nazi Party, then William Shirer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich is one of the best places to go. They're both excellent examinations of the political systems. They are incredibly detailed and incredibly real, raw and visceral in their accounts. So those two, I think, if you're interested at all in authoritarianism, are must-reads. Rise and Fall of the Third Reich is very long. It's about 1,500 pages, but it reads very well and it's an excellent book. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn also had a fictional book, which is Cancer Ward, which again looks at the authoritarianism in a Soviet republic, but it also looks about this idea of spirit and how you can maintain your individual sanity when you are part of the downtrodden. It is, as you'd expect, a story about those living on a cancer ward at a time where the treatment for cancer was incredibly brutal and where they were just in the early stages of developing radiotherapy. It's an incredible look at the lives of the sick, of what would be considered the underclasses, and how they are not at all considered by the regime. Their cares are not attended to at all, and they are frankly abused by society. It provides another lens to the oppression narrative, one that looks as health, as well as poverty and an authoritarian force, and I think it is a very interesting triad to contemplate. Another examination of the underclasses and the oppression that they face from a different time period would be Dickens. And I think that is probably one of the classic examples when we think of the examination of poverty within the UK. I'm not so familiar with Dickens's work, but in terms of a gentle introduction to this theme, I would suggest A Christmas Carol, to be honest, or Oliver Twist. Looking at a totally different perspective of the poverty-wealth dynamic, I think we can talk about Fitzgerald. Where Orwell examines the lives of the poor, Fitzgerald looks at the lives of the wealthy and the relationship from that perspective. The Great Gatsby is probably the most obvious exploration of that, but I think Tender as a Night is a more interesting one, as we see more distinctly the relationship between the rich and the poor, and also we see how wealth can be used to control, which is more directly relevant to George Orwell's works. However, I think both are good perspectives on opulence, and they write about the Roaring Twenties, which was really peak opulence in America. Next book I would recommend would be Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Similar to Cancer Ward in terms of setting, it looks more at small rebellions and how the mentally ill are oppressed and cast out of society. It's a book about small rebellions which crop up throughout George Orwell's works. It also looks at the power of an individual and the hope that they can spread by maintaining their spirit. But then it looks at the maintenance of principles in the face of an oppressive regime. And when the consequences will be real, do you stick to your principles or do you give them up in an effort to save yourself? Finally, I think that Dostoevsky's novels are also a good follow-up to George Orwell. Notes from the Underground is practically the same book as Keep the Aspidistra Flying. They both have the same major plot points. If you have read Keep the Aspidistra Flying and you want to get a taste of Dostoevsky's work, then Notes from the Underground is a very easy transition, as it's basically the same book. But I think it is actually quite an easy transition into Crime and Punishment. Although Dostoevsky's writing is perhaps a bit more complicated and the plot is more textured, let's say, you could almost say that Crime and Punishment is the novel of 1984, but within one character. within Raskolnikov. You have the temptation and allure of Julia, whereas within Crime and Punishment, within Raskolnikov, that is the allure towards intelligence and the power that that can bring. It is the ability that that will lead to oppress and to rebel against the, I suppose, oppressive poverty that exists within Crime and Punishment, as opposed to an authoritarian force. And then in terms of the character of O'Brien and the punishment that Winston faces within 1984, that again stems from Raskolnikov. It is his conscience which oppresses him and which really crushes the life out of him and drives him into total misery. So if you have read 1984 and you're curious about Dostoevsky, then I think that is a fairly smooth transition to Crime and Punishment, and you will see some of the same themes that emerge within there, although the oppression, the torture, and the eventual punishment stems from the individual, not from an external source. Let me know if you think there are any books or authors who are also adjacent to George Orwell, and other than that, I'll see you in the next one.